The argument is, if you look at this, where Eve crushes the serpent's head. Now, there's a lot of nuances to this. This is believed to be the very first promise that a Savior is coming, where the consequences of sin is death upon mankind. And the serpent, the idea of crushing his head represents taking away his authority and destroying like his authority. The crown, the head, is symbolic of authority typically. And so you have this image of or the way it sounds on the surface is Adam or Eve's children, someone who's an offspring of Eve, her seed, is going to crush the authority of the serpent. And so, metaphorically, we have Jesus, right? So this is the first indication to Jesus, where Jesus came to strip the authority of sin, which is death, to strip that away from Satan. And it's that first indicator of a Savior to come. So proto-evangelium. Now the question that comes up here is, okay, so God said it's not good for man to be alone. He also said all these other things. Why is this considered the first promise when there's other declarations that are made? Like, that struck me, like why in chapters 1 and 2 and half of 3 in Genesis, there's other things that God says, but this is the promise. And so that's curiosity, right? And so when I go back and I go, okay, let's reflect in context and let me reread. So let me go back to Genesis 1, read this passage I've read 100 times and see if there's anything new or anything that helps me reconcile that disconnect in my brain or that question I have. Why is this the promise? The first promise that theologians said. Like, God didn't say, and behold, my first promise, right? It's for thousands of years theologians have said, this is the first promise in the Bible. And so the curiosity says, why this? And then the courage to explore it goes, maybe they're wrong, right? And oftentimes they're not, but sometimes I kind of think they might be. And so you got to hold that with humility. But if I'm looking at this going, okay, God, does he promise Adam that he'll have dominion over the land? Is that a promise? Kind of sounds like. Does God promise that Adam will never be alone and gives a woman? And the distinction I came to is up until Adam and Eve sinned, there was really no need for God to make a promise because the promises were already created. God created the Garden of Eden story in Genesis 2 is really about heaven. This is what it looks like to be everything under God's rule. Like Adam and Eve, at the end of chapter 2, Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. Like, what type of world would you have to live in where you could be naked and unashamed? Right? It would have to be one where there's no sin. It would be heaven. And boy, it's all beautiful. So in that section, God isn't making a promise. He's describing the world that he created for Adam and Eve. So I came up with, like, you could argue that the whole creation story is God's first promise. But as textually, as you get into it, this is the first time God makes a declaration of what will happen. It's a prophetic promise. So I agree that should be called the proto-evangelium, like the first promise in the Bible, because I look at it in context of the verses around it.